The message did not arrive politely. It did not knock. It did not wait. It tore through every signal on Earth at the same moment. Every radio station, every satellite channel, every emergency broadcast system, every private communication network. And it spoke in a voice that felt like it had been old before the first human ever looked up at the sky. The words came in every language at once, clear and cold, with no warmth and no hesitation. We are the Vakareth. You have grown beyond your permitted space. You have moved into 3 star systems that have belonged to us since before your kind learned to walk upright. We have watched you for 10,000 years. We have been patient with you, the way one is patient with something small and still growing. That patience is now finished. You will surrender your outer colonies. You will dismantle your settlements in the 3 claimed systems. You will submit to our authority. You have 30 days. If you do not comply, we will demonstrate to you what we demonstrated to the last 7 civilizations that ignored our words. Then the voice stopped. No ship appeared in the sky. No weapon was fired. No second message followed. The Vakareth spoke once, clearly, and then left nothing behind but silence and 30 days. On Earth, the silence lasted about 4 seconds before everything broke open. Governments convened emergency sessions within the hour. Military commands went to their highest alert levels. Colony stations across 3 outer systems began evacuation debates before anyone had even finished reading the transcript. Every news channel on the planet ran the same 3 words on repeat: 30 days remaining. The internet collapsed twice under the weight of people trying to talk to each other all at once. Commander Dale Sutton heard the message the same way everyone else did. It simply arrived, mid-morning, while he was sitting in the small galley of the Ardent Cross with a cup of coffee and a report he had been putting off reading. The coffee went cold. The report stayed unread. He sat at the table for a while with the transcript on his screen and read it through several times, slowly, the way he did with anything that carried real weight. Dale was 53 years old. He was not a tall man, but he had a kind of stillness about him that made people pay attention when he spoke. His hair had gone mostly gray in the last few years, and there were lines in his face from decades of decisions made in difficult places. He had commanded the Ardent Cross for 6 years. She was a science and diplomatic vessel, built for exploration and contact, not for combat. She had no weapons worth mentioning, no armor plating, no battle systems. What she had was a crew of 11 specialists, a reliable engine, and a reputation for going places other ships hesitated to approach. Dale called his crew to the main briefing room. They came quickly. 11 people settled around the table, and nobody spoke for a moment. They had all heard the message. They all wore the same expression, that specific look of people who understand something serious has happened and are waiting to hear what comes next. Lieutenant Kara Hensley sat near the front. She was the ship's linguist and cultural analyst, a sharp woman in her mid-30s who had spent her entire career studying how different species communicated. She had short dark hair and a habit of writing notes by hand, even when a digital pad was right beside her. She was already writing now. Engineer Pete Vargas sat near the back, arms folded, expression unreadable. He was a quiet man who said very little in group settings, and then said exactly the right thing when something needed fixing. Navigator Lena Park had the star charts already pulled up on the room's main screen. She had anticipated that they would be needed. She usually anticipated things. Communications Officer Frank Delaney sat closest to the wall panel, monitoring the incoming transmissions from Earth Command, which were arriving fast and in large numbers. Dale looked around the table at all of them, and then spoke plainly. You have all heard the message. I am not going to pretend it is anything other than what it is. A species that calls itself the Vakareth has told us to abandon 3 colony systems and submit to their authority in 30 days. They have implied that failure to comply will result in consequences. Earth Command is currently in crisis mode. The colonies are frightened, and as of right now, we are the closest crewed vessel to the region of space where the signal originated. He let that sit for a moment. Kara looked up from her notes. The translation method is the first thing worth paying attention to, she said. No species we have ever encountered can broadcast into every language simultaneously. That is not just advanced technology. That is technology that requires a deep understanding of every language it reached, including the ones we developed in the last 500 years. Whatever the Vakareth are, they have been watching us for a very long time. That part of their message was not an exaggeration. Or they want us to believe it is not an exaggeration, Pete said from the back. Either way, the effect is the same, Dale said. We cannot dismiss them. We cannot assume the threat is empty. He paused. But I am also not willing to assume that this has only one ending. Kara, what else did the message tell you? Kara set down her pen. The wording is interesting. They said they reminded the 7 civilizations that ignored them. Not punished, not destroyed, reminded. She kept her voice even and careful. That is a specific choice of word. You do not remind something that no longer exists. The 7 civilizations may still be out there. The room was quiet for a moment. Lita spoke without turning away from the star charts. The signal came from approximately 4 light days in that direction. She pointed to a region on the map that sat just beyond the boundary of the 3rd colony system, the outermost of the 3 the Vakareth were claiming. If any vessel was going to attempt contact, we are the one that could get there first. Frank looked up from his communications panel. Earth Command is requesting options. They want to know which vessels are positioned to respond. Everyone at the table already knew the answer. They looked at the chart. Then most of them looked at Dale. He did not rush his response. He looked at the star charts for a long moment. He thought about the 30-day deadline, about the colonies with their thousands of people, and their children, and their gardens growing under artificial light. About 7 civilizations that had been reminded and not destroyed. About a species old enough to have been watching humanity since before it had cities. Then he looked at his crew. They were good people, every single one of them. They had chosen this kind of work, not because it was safe, but because it mattered. They had gone with him into uncertain places before, and they had come home, and they had never once complained about the uncertainty. Frank, he said, send a message to Earth Command. Tell them the Ardent Cross is in position to attempt first contact with the Vakareth. Tell them we request authorization to move toward the signal's origin for the purpose of opening dialogue. He paused. Not war, not surrender. Dialogue. Frank nodded and turned to his panel. Dale picked up his coffee. It was completely cold. He drank it anyway. Outside the viewports of the Ardent Cross, the stars sat still and ancient and utterly indifferent. 4 light days away, in a direction that felt somehow different now from all the other directions in space, something very old was waiting to see what humanity would do next. Dale looked at that particular piece of sky for a long moment. Earth Command took 4 days to make a decision. Dale used all 4 of them. He did not wait for permission to prepare. Waiting for permission to prepare was the kind of thing that got people killed, or in this case, got civilizations erased. He called Kara into a working session the same evening the message arrived, and the 2 of them spent 3 hours going through the Vakareth transmission word by word. He had Pete run full diagnostics on every system the Ardent Cross carried, not because he expected a fight, but because a vessel that left for the unknown needed to be running perfectly. He had Lena plot a dozen different approach routes, and rank them by travel time and visibility, meaning how visible the Ardent Cross would be to any long-range sensors along the way. He had Frank monitor every incoming transmission, from Earth and from the colonies. There were a great many of them. The colonies were scared in different ways. The people on the innermost of the 3 claimed systems, a settled station called Kepler-4, where the Ardent Cross was currently docked, were frightened and loud about it, filling every public channel with arguments about whether to begin evacuation. The outermost colony was quieter, which was somehow worse. The quietest people were usually the most afraid. Earth Command was not frightened so much as overwhelmed. They received proposals from 17 different advisory groups in the first 48 hours. 3 of those proposals recommended immediate military response. 2 recommended unconditional compliance. The rest fell somewhere in between and mostly contradicted each other. The only thing everyone agreed on was that someone needed to do something, and they needed to do it carefully. On the 3rd day, Kara came to Dale in the late evening with something new. She sat across the small table in his quarters with a cup of tea and a notebook that had been filled front to back with observations. And she looked like a person who had not slept properly in several days and did not care at all. "I have been running analysis on the signal structure," she said. "Not just the words. The transmission method itself has age markers, resonance patterns in the carrier wave that our instruments associate with communication technology from roughly 8,000 years ago. The Vakareth have been using the same system for 8 millennia. They did not build something new to threaten us. They used what they have always used." "Which tells us what?" Dale asked. "That they are genuinely old, that this is not performance, that when they say 10,000 years of patience, they mean it." Kara opened her notebook to a page dense with notes. "It also tells us something about their psychology. When a civilization uses the same tool for 8,000 years, it is not because they cannot build something better. It is because they stopped needing to. They have not been challenged enough to require innovation." She tapped the notebook. "They are not prepared for something they have not seen before." Dale looked at her carefully. "And what have they not seen before?" "Someone who does not fight and does not fold," she said. "Every species they have encountered has done one or the other. Either they pushed back and were overwhelmed, or they complied and withdrew. The Vakareth have a fixed script. They send the message. They wait. They receive either defiance or surrender. They respond accordingly." She paused. "We could try a third option. We go and talk to them. We go and talk to them honestly. We do not threaten. We do not capitulate. We arrive as something they have no category for, a species that heard the ultimatum and came to ask questions." Kara leaned forward slightly. "I think that would confuse them. And confused is better than decided." Dale thought about this for a long time. He trusted Kara's instincts. In 6 years aboard the Ardent Cross, she had translated 4 alien languages, successfully mediated a territorial dispute between 2 species that had been exchanging weapons fire for decades, and once talked a suspicious and heavily armed patrol vessel into standing down by figuring out that their communication system had a 3-second delay, and adjusting her phrasing accordingly. She understood minds that were not human ones in a way that went beyond training. She felt her way into them. "What does the 7 civilizations tell you?" he asked. "The word was reminded," she said. "Not destroyed, not punished, not removed. Reminded. It is a word that implies the subject survived the reminder. It implies the subject still exists and still carries the memory." She closed the notebook. "I believe those 7 civilizations are still out there, somewhere in their original systems, living within the boundaries the Vakareth set. Possibly with no idea that the species who set those boundaries is still active and still watching." A pause. "Or possibly with a great deal of idea, possibly worshipping them from a safe distance." "And the reminder itself?" Dale asked quietly. "Something powerful enough to be unforgettable. Something that stopped expansion entirely without destroying the capacity to survive." She met his eyes. "Not a weapon of annihilation. A demonstration. They wanted those civilizations to survive as a lesson, not disappear as a warning." Kara set down her tea. "Dale, a species that has chosen demonstration over destruction for 10,000 years, is a species that has reasons for doing so. And reasons can be talked about." On the morning of the 4th day, Earth Command sent their authorization. The Ardent Cross was not to provoke, not to negotiate formal terms, not to make any promises on behalf of humanity. They were to make contact, assess the situation, gather whatever information was possible, and report back. That was the official scope of the mission. Dale gathered his crew together again and read them the authorization. Then he set it down and looked around the table. I want to be honest with you all, he said. What we are being asked to do is extremely careful and limited work. We are not heroes going to win this situation. We are 11 people on a science vessel going to meet something very old and very powerful. And our job is to not make anything worse. He paused. I will not tell you there is no risk. There is. If anyone wants off this ship before we leave, I will arrange it, and I will think no less of you for it. He waited. Nobody moved. Pete looked faintly insulted. Kara was already writing in her notebook again. Lena had her hands on the navigation console as though she was ready to go right now. Frank raised an eyebrow. Are we done with the speech part? Dale allowed a small smile. We are done with the speech part. They undocked from Kepler Station an hour before the local station clock marked dawn. The Ardent Cross slid quietly out of berth, turned her nose toward that particular piece of empty space 4 light days away, and began to move. On the way, Frank intercepted 2 more Vakareth transmissions. Not directed at Earth this time, but passing between points that suggested internal communication within the Vakareth fleet or command structure. They were short and clipped, and Kara worked through the night to pull fragments of meaning from them. What she found, she shared with Dale over breakfast on the 2nd day of travel. Lesser kind, she said, reading from her notes. Waiting, the count of days, expected compliance. She folded the paper. They are not nervous, Dale. They are not even particularly interested. This is administrative to them. They sent the message, they started the clock, and they are waiting for the result they always get. Dale looked out the viewport at the stars ahead. Then they are about to have an unusual morning, he said. He meant it lightly, but there was something serious underneath it, something that had been building in him since the moment the transmission first arrived. Humanity had 3 colonies out here, built with years of work, and filled with people who had chosen to be pioneers. Children were growing up on those stations. People had made lives there. And somewhere ahead, something ancient and powerful had decided those lives were inconvenient. Dale was not angry. Anger was not useful. But he was decided, in the quiet and thorough way that he got decided about things. And when Dale Sutton got decided about something, the universe generally found it easier to adjust than to argue. The Ardent Cross kept moving through the dark. They saw the Vakareth ship on the 8th day of travel, and for a long moment, nobody on the bridge said anything at all. It was not a ship in any sense that the word usually carried. Ships had shapes you could hold in your head. Long bodies and engine arrays, cargo bays and docking rings, things built to a purpose you could understand by looking at them. This was different. It was a structure in space the size of a small moon, dark and asymmetrical, covered in formations that might have been weapon arrays or sensor towers or architectural features from a culture so different that the distinction between those things had stopped mattering. It did not look built so much as it looked grown, the way a reef grows, slowly and without hurrying, adding itself to itself across centuries until it became something vast and self-sufficient and permanent. It sat in open space without orbiting anything. It did not need to orbit anything. It simply was, the way a mountain simply is, and it had clearly been that way for a very long time. Lena's voice was steady when she spoke, but it was quieter than usual. Running scans. The hull material doesn't match anything in the database. Not any alloy, not any compound, not any material we have cataloged from any known species. She studied her screen carefully. The mass reading is consistent with a structure that has been continuously added to for several thousand years at minimum. Any weapon signatures? Dale asked. I can detect energy concentrations in about 40 locations across the hull. She paused. But I also can't rule out that those are just power systems. At this scale, everything looks like a weapon signature. The Ardent Cross felt, in that moment, like exactly what it was, a small and fragile thing floating next to something ancient. The crew on the bridge did not panic, because they were professionals, and they had all chosen to be here. But there was a particular quality to the silence that said everyone was very aware of the comparison. Pete came to the bridge without being called. He stood near the back, and looked at the screen for a while. "Well," he said at last, "at least it is not pointed at us." Nobody had an answer for that, but the tension eased a fraction. The communication channel opened 3 minutes later. It opened without invitation and without preamble, exactly as the original transmission had. And the voice that came through was not the broadcast voice from before. This was direct, a single channel between the ardent cross and whatever was on the other side of that hull. And underneath the translated words, there was a texture to it, a tone that Kara identified immediately as bearing the emotional signature of someone experiencing mild inconvenience. Not anger, not alarm, something closer to the feeling of an administrator who has seen the same paperwork arrive on their desk for the 1,000th time. Small vessel, you are not a military ship. You do not carry a government delegation. Your vessel profile does not match any class we associate with formal contact procedures. Identify your purpose. Dale leaned forward in his chair and kept his voice completely calm. My name is Dale Sutton. I command the exploration vessel Ardent Cross out of the 3rd Outer Colony System, which I understand is one of the territories you have laid claim to. I am here because my ship was the closest one to your position, and because it seemed to me that the better response to your message was to come and speak to you, rather than to spend 30 days saying nothing. There was a pause. It was not a long pause, but something in its quality was different from what had come before. The board administrator texture in the channel shifted just slightly. You were sent here alone, one vessel, no military escort, no formal government representative. We came on our own initiative, Dale said. Earth Command authorized our approach, but the decision to come started with this crew. Another pause, and this one was longer. When the voice returned, the texture had shifted further. There was something underneath it now that Kara, watching her translation feeds with intense focus, would describe later as the sound of a pattern being broken. Every civilization that has received our ultimatum has responded in one of two ways. They have assembled military force in defiance, or they have sent formal delegations offering compliance. In 10,000 years of this process, no civilization has sent a single science vessel crewed by volunteers who came to ask questions. We are a curious people, Dale said simply. The silence this time lasted long enough that Lena quietly checked whether the channel was still open. It was. Then the Vakareth spoke again, and the tone had changed in a way that Kara could not fully categorize yet, but would spend a great deal of time trying to describe in her notes afterward. It was not warmth exactly. It was closer to the feeling of a window being opened in a room that had been closed for a very long time. State your purpose, Commander Sutton. Dale had thought about this answer for 8 days. He had turned it over while he ate, and while he slept, and while he stood at the viewport in the early ship hours, watching the stars move slowly past. He had considered careful diplomatic language and decided against it. He had considered formal statements of humanity's position and decided against those too. In the end, he had arrived at the simplest and most honest version of what he actually wanted. I want to understand you, he said. The message you sent mentions 7 civilizations. I want to know what happened to them. I want to know what your claim on those star systems actually means to you, and why it still matters after 10,000 years. I want to know whether there is a version of this situation that ends without anyone losing something they have worked and sacrificed to build. He let that sit for a moment. I thought the best way to find out was to come here and ask you directly. That is my purpose. Kara had stopped writing. She was watching the translation feeds very carefully, reading not just the words, but the layers underneath them, the way she always did when a conversation was at a turning point. Later she would tell Dale that in the moment after he finished speaking, the emotional resonance in the Vakareth channel dropped everything it had been carrying before, the boredom, the mild irritation, the texture of routine, and became something she had never encountered in any alien communication she had studied. She struggled to find a word for it. The closest she could manage was recognition. Not recognition of Dale specifically, but recognition of something, as though a question had just been asked that had been waiting a very long time to be asked. and had begun to give up hope. "No one," the Vakareth said, "has ever asked." The words were quiet, quieter than anything the Vakareth had said before. And in the silence that followed, the ardent cross sat small and steady against the vast darkness, and Dale Sutton waited, and did not rush, and let the quiet do its work. It was Pete who spoke first among the crew, in a low voice not meant for the open channel. "That worked," he said, with the tone of a man who is genuinely surprised that the plan functioned. "It is not a plan," Kara said, still watching her feeds. "It is just honesty." "Which apparently nobody has tried before," Pete said. A new signal came through the channel, a navigational beacon broadcasting a docking approach corridor, an invitation to come closer, an invitation to come aboard. Dale looked at Lena. She pulled up the beacon on her screen and plotted the approach vector without being asked. He looked at the crew around him. 11 people, one small ship, something enormous and ancient waiting ahead of them, with for the first time in a very long time, an open door. "Take us in," Dale said. Dale chose 2 people to go with him. Kara, because she was the best communicator he had ever worked with, and because this conversation was going to need someone who could read far more than just the words. And Pete, because Pete was steady in the way that very few people manage to be steady. Not because he was unafraid, but because he made a practical decision early in any difficult situation to focus on what was in front of him, rather than what might happen. That quality was useful in uncertain places. He left Lena in command of the Ardent Cross, with the clearest instructions he had ever given anyone. "If anything changes, anything, you leave. You get far enough away to be safe, and you get word back to Earth. You do not wait, you do not come after us. You go." Lena had looked at him for a long moment with an expression he knew well. It was the expression of someone who was about to follow orders they profoundly disagreed with. Then she said, "Yes, sir," and he knew she would keep her word. The boarding corridor the Vakareth sent was a tunnel of amber light that extended from the hull of their vessel and connected to the Ardent Cross's secondary airlock. It was warm inside the tunnel. Not warm like temperature control, but warm like something that understood what warmth meant to biological creatures and had made a deliberate choice. Dale noticed that and stored it away without commenting on it. The interior of the Vakareth vessel pressed on all of them in the first few minutes, and each of them handled it differently. Dale felt the scale of it the way you feel the scale of a very old forest, not threatening exactly, but deeply indifferent to your size, simply existing in dimensions that were not built around your comfort. The corridors were wide and tall, lit by that same sourceless amber glow from the tunnel, and the walls were covered in structures that were neither decoration nor functional components, but something in between. The kind of details that appear when a civilization has spent so long in a space that the space itself has become an expression of everything they are. Kara moved through it, with her head turning slowly from side to side, taking in everything. She had a small recorder running, and a notebook in her hand, and her eyes moved the way they always moved when she was processing something extraordinary. Quick and systematic, like someone reading a text in a language they know well enough to understand, but not yet well enough to read without effort. Pete walked steadily and said nothing. He looked at structural elements. He looked at what might have been load-bearing points and what might have been power conduits. When they passed through a junction where 4 corridors met, in a space that opened upward into something Dale could not see the top of, Pete looked up for one long moment, and then looked back at the corridor ahead and kept walking. 3 Vakareth were waiting for them. They were tall, not imposingly so, not in the way of a species that had evolved size as a weapon, but tall in the way of something that had simply never had a reason to be smaller. Their skin was gray-silver and caught the amber light in a way that made them seem slightly luminous. Their faces were old in a way that was not easy to describe, because it was not the oldness of age. It was not wrinkles or weariness, or the marks that time makes on a body. It was the oldness of continuity. They looked like beings who had been present for so long that presence itself had become their most visible feature. The one who led them introduced herself through the translation system as something that meant, as closely as any human word could approximate, keeper of the first account. Kara translated it as vessels when she needed a working name for her notes, and the name settled and stayed. Vessels walked them through the interior of the ship, and she did not speak for a while. She seemed to be deciding something, or perhaps waiting to see how they moved through her space. Dale had the feeling of being assessed, not by any instrument, but by the simple act of being watched, and he walked calmly, and did not pretend that he was not a small creature in a very large place. She brought them eventually to a chamber that was unlike the corridors, not in its scale, which was still enormous, but in its quality. The walls here were alive with projected light that resolved, as their eyes adjusted, into images. An archive, continuous and layered, running through the air around them, like a living library. It took Dale a moment to understand what he was looking at. It was every civilization the Vakarith had ever encountered. Hundreds of them, spread across the chamber, each one represented by its own thread of record. World shapes, language fragments, images of beings in their natural environments, encounters documented and preserved across thousands of years. The oldest records were at the far end of the chamber, and they glowed dimly, their age evident even to eyes that could not read the Vakarith notation system. The newest were bright and sharp, and two of them Dale recognized as species humanity had already made contact with. He stood in the middle of it and felt something shift quietly inside him. "We were worshipped once," Vessel said. Her voice, through the translation system, carried no pride in the statement. It carried something more complicated, something that in a human would have sounded like the specific kind of tiredness that comes not from exhaustion, but from long consideration. "By many of the worlds you see here, we were young then. Young for us means something different than it means for you. But we were younger, and we did not discourage the worship. We claimed territories because territories meant power, and power meant survival. We built habits of authority because authority protected us from things we feared." "You were afraid," Kara said. It was not a question, but it was spoken gently, like an observation offered with care. "We were afraid," Vessels confirmed. "Of what? It is difficult to explain to a species that has not lived long enough to see civilizations rise and fail and leave nothing behind. We were afraid of being one of the ones that left nothing. So we claimed, and we held, and we enforced, and it worked for a very long time." "The 7 civilizations," Dale said. Vessels moved to a part of the archive, and the records shifted to show 7 threads, each one still glowing, not dimly like the ancient ones, but steadily with the light of something still existing. "They received the same ultimatum you received," she said. "They were shown what we could do, enough that they understood the cost of continued defiance, and they chose to remain within boundaries that we set. They live still. Some of them have built religions around the memory of what they encountered. Some of them have simply forgotten, the way you forget the name of the thing that frightened you as a child, but still feel the fear when the dark comes." A pause. "They are alive, but they did not grow beyond where we stopped them." "And you enforced those boundaries ever since," Dale said. "We enforced them because we had always enforced them," Vessels said. There was something careful and painful in how she said it. "There is a kind of habit that a civilization can fall into when it has done something for long enough. Not cruelty, not malice, simply the absence of questioning. We sent the ultimatum this time the way we have always sent it, without stopping to ask whether the reasons for sending it still existed." She was quiet for a moment. "It took a ship of 12 humans from a civilization we have been watching for 10,000 years to walk through our door and ask us that question." Pete, who had been standing quietly near the edge of the archive, spoke up without preamble. "What were you originally afraid of?" Vessels looked at him. "Scarcity," she said. Other civilizations competing for the same resources, being overwhelmed, being erased. She looked at the archive around her. We outlasted every threat we were afraid of. We outlasted them by such a margin that we outlasted the memory of them as well. And then we kept going, because stopping felt like admitting that everything we had built was for something that no longer existed. The room was quiet. Dale looked around at the archive. Hundreds of civilizations, thousands of years of contact and record and memory, and he thought about what it would mean to carry that much history, to have been present for so much, to have started afraid and kept moving until the fear was gone but the motion remained. "You have been doing this out of habit," he said. "Just clearly." "Yes," Vessels said, "and nobody ever asked you to stop." Another pause. Longer. "No one," she said, "has ever asked." It was the second time those words had come through the translation system. They did not sound any smaller the second time. If anything, they sounded larger, in the way that some admissions grow the more times they are spoken aloud. Dale looked at Kara. She was writing, but her eyes were wet, and she was not trying to hide it. He looked at Pete. Pete was looking at Vessels with the expression of a man working through something complex and taking his time with it. Dale looked at Vessels. "Then I am asking now," he said, "not as a formal negotiator, not with any authority to speak for humanity officially, just as the person who was close enough to come, and he came." He paused. "Is there a version of this that does not require anyone to lose what they built?" Vessels was silent for a long time, long enough that the light in the archive seemed to settle and deepen around them. Then she said, "Perhaps we should sit down." And for the first time in 10,000 years of ultimatums and demonstrations and the long wait of unchallenged habit, something in the Vakarith archive room shifted in a direction it had never shifted before. They talked for 3 days. Not without pause. There were hours when Dale and Kara and Pete returned to the Ardent Cross to sleep and eat, and let their minds process everything they had absorbed. But the conversations with Vessels were long and layered, and each one went deeper than the one before. Lena ran the ship while they were gone, and kept her worry quiet and professional. And Frank maintained the relay back to Earth, sending condensed updates every 12 hours, which Earth Command received with a mixture of relief and escalating nervousness. The other 2 Vakarith who had met them initially were present for parts of the conversations, but mostly observed. They were older than Vessels, if age among the Vakarith worked the way it appeared to. And they watched the dialogue with an expression that Kara described in her notes as the look of beings who have decided to see how something ends before they decide what they think of it. Vessels herself was different on the second day. Not warmer exactly, but more present. There was a quality to her attention that had not been there on the first day. Something engaged, something that in a human might have been called curiosity, but in the Vakarith felt like a reactivation, as though a faculty that had not been used in a very long time was slowly and carefully being reopened. On the second day she showed them more of the archive. She showed them civilizations that had complied with the ultimatum, 17 in total across the 10,000 years of enforcement, the 7 mentioned in the broadcast, and 10 others who had received private warnings before the formal ultimatum process. All of them still existed. All of them were alive and functioning, most of them in strong condition. But none of them had expanded beyond the points where the Vakarith had stopped them. Some of those civilizations had turned inward and built remarkable things, art, science, philosophy, freed by the enforced boundary from the energy cost of expansion. Others had stagnated, losing the forward momentum that exploration and growth provided, turning in slow circles of repetition for generations. "You did not know which outcome would result when you enforced the boundary," Kara said. "We did not consider the outcomes," Vessels replied. "That is the most honest answer." On the third day, Dale asked the question he had been building toward since the beginning. "What do the territories actually mean to you? Not historically, not by habit. Right now, today, What would you lose if those 3 colony systems continued to exist? Vessels did not answer immediately. She stood in the archive room and looked at the records around her, and was quiet for long enough that Dale began to wonder whether he had pushed too far. Then she said something that Kara translated carefully, twice, to make certain she had it right. Nothing material. The resources in those systems are not ones we use or need. The space itself is not contested by any living population of our people. We have no settlement in those regions. We have no planned settlement. A pause. The territories represent a claim that was made before anyone now living made it, for reasons that no longer exist, by a civilization that was afraid of things that no longer threaten it. The silence after that was the most significant silence of the 3 days. Pete broke it, in his quiet and practical way. So what you are describing, he said, is a property dispute where one party no longer needs or uses the property, enforced out of principle alone. Vessels looked at him for a moment. Yes, she said, that is an accurate description. That is, Pete said carefully, a problem with a solution. The solution that emerged was not fast, and it was not simple, but it had a shape that everyone in the archive room could see once they started looking for it. Dale could not sign formal agreements. He did not have that authority, and had never pretended to. But he could carry the shape of the agreement back to Earth, and to the colony stations, and Vessels could bring it to whatever deliberative body the Vakarith used for decisions of this kind. And both sides could then send proper representatives to finalize the details with the structure already built. What the structure looked like was this. The 3 colony systems would remain. The humans living there would keep their homes and their work and the lives they had built. The Vakarith would formally revise their territorial claims to exclude those systems, not as a retreat, not as a defeat, but as a deliberate and documented revision by a civilization mature enough to reconsider the decisions of its own past. In exchange, humanity would establish a set of contact protocols going forward, channels through which expansion plans would be shared in advance, concerns could be raised, and dialogue could happen before ultimatums became necessary. And both sides would contribute to a shared archive, an exchange of records that each civilization would have access to. The archive had been Vessel's idea. You keep records, she told Dale in the last hour of the final conversation. We have always kept records. There is much in ours that your people would find valuable, and there is something in yours that we have not encountered in a very long time. What is that? Dale asked. The early part, she said. The beginning. Your people are still in the beginning of what they will become. We have not spoken to a civilization in its beginning since we were in ours. It is something we did not know we had missed until now. Dale looked at her for a moment. How did yours end? He asked. The beginning, I mean. Vessels was quiet. Then she said, We became afraid, and fear made us close ourselves. And the closing lasted so long that it became who we were. She looked at the archive around her. Thousands of years of contact, all of it following the same script. All of it ending in either defiance or compliance. None of it ever ending in this. Perhaps, she said quietly, we are beginning something again. The Ardent Cross left the Vakarith vessel on the 11th day of the 30-day deadline. Dale watched the massive structure recede through the rear viewport, as Lena guided them away, and he stayed at the viewport for a long time. There was something that needed to be looked at and let settle before he went to do anything else. He was not a man who rushed the settling of things. They reached Kepler Station in good time, and Dale sent his full report to Earth Command before the docking clamps engaged. It was the longest report he had ever written. Kara's linguistic and cultural analysis alone ran to 14 pages, and would eventually be considered one of the most important documents in the history of human-alien contact. Pete's technical observations about Vakarith engineering would keep research departments occupied for years. Frank had documented every signal exchange in precise detail. But the summary at the beginning of Dale's report was short. He wrote, The Vakarith are not our enemies. They are an old civilization that has been carrying an old habit for 10,000 years, and in all that time, no one had ever arrived at their door without a weapon or a surrender. We arrived with neither. We arrived with questions. It turned out that questions were the one thing they did not have a response prepared for. The 3 colonies are safe. The people there can stay. The details still need to be worked out by people with more formal authority than I have, but the shape is there, and it holds. All of this was done by 1 science vessel and 11 people who chose to go when they did not have to go. He paused before writing the last line, and then he wrote it. I do not think this works if we come with more. I think a fleet makes them remember what they are afraid of. I think a surrender makes them remember what they have always done. What we had was a ship small enough that it could not possibly be a threat, crewed by people whose only credential was that they came because someone needed to come. That was enough. It turned out to be exactly enough. The crew gathered in the galley that evening. Someone produced a bottle of something that technically qualified as wine by a generous interpretation of the word, and cups were passed around without ceremony. The station outside the viewports hummed with its ordinary noise, and the stars beyond it were as ancient and vast and indifferent as they had always been. For the record, no weapons were fired. We do not have weapons worth firing, Pete said. Which, Kara said, was probably exactly why it worked. Lena leaned back in her chair and looked at Dale with the particular look she reserved for moments when she wanted him to know she was proud of something, but was not going to say it directly because that was not how she operated. Dale raised his cup. To the Ardent Cross, he said. They drank. Outside, the colonies glittered in the dark like small bright promises, exactly where they had always been, exactly where they would stay. Somewhere 4 light days away, a vessel the size of a small moon sat in open space with its archive glowing, and its oldest habits beginning, very slowly and very carefully, to change. And somewhere in the records of both civilizations, this day was being written down. The day a small ship flew towards something ancient and powerful, and chose instead of weapons or surrender, to simply ask. It was, as it turned out, the oldest move there was, and nobody had thought to try it until now.